Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction and also for the invite to come and speak to you. And I promise there's not going to be any chemistry in this talk. It will just be briefly mentioned, so don't worry too much. So I've been asked to come and talk to you today about INDAIRPOLLNET, which is a European network carrying out research on indoor air quality. So next slide, please. So I'm going to briefly talk about why we should study indoor air pollution after that excellent introduction from Sani, so that'll be very quick. And then just for those of you who don't know what a cost action is and what the composition of INDAIRPOLLNET is, who we all are, and then a bit about what we're doing. So we're just starting the final year of this 4-year network, so I can tell you a little bit about what we've been doing and what we plan to end up with. So next slide, please. So this schematic really just aims to highlight some of the sources of indoor air pollution that you might find in a typical home. And that can be activity dependent. And obviously there are different activities in different parts of your house. So Sani's already alluded to some of these. So we've got cleaning products in the bathroom and kitchen. You may have smokers in the home. There's also less obvious sources, I guess. So if you have an integral garage on your home, the fumes from your car can leak into the house. Things like solvents and paints can be stored in the garage as well, or maybe in a part of the house, and obviously some of the fumes from those can escape. And then some of the less obvious sources, maybe some of the furnishing, things like carpets. So there are many sources of indoor air pollution, and what we're interested in the network is, as well as thinking about these sources, is something that's less often considered, and that's the transformations of these chemicals once they're released into your home. Okay, next slide, please. So the result of all of these different sources of indoor air pollution is that when you look at concentrations of some chemical pollutants in air, particularly volatile organic compounds. So these are a range of compounds that contain carbon and hydrogen and sometimes also oxygen. But often the concentrations of these things are much higher indoors than they are outdoors, particularly if that home or office, whatever, is poorly ventilated. So there's lots of reasons to worry about indoor air pollution. And we've known about this for many years, but it's become more topical recently. So if we can have the next slide, please. There are a number of reasons for that. So if you think about how things have changed over the last 50 years or so, one thing that's changed quite a lot is our behaviour. And I think the role of behaviour in understanding indoor air quality is becoming more and more important. So the top two pictures there on the left show what children might have done in the 1950s, 1960s, been kicked out of the house for the day to go and play and come back for tea sort of thing, to and I know this is stereotyping a bit, but maybe the more typical activities of children these days, they spend a lot more time indoors. And the same goes for adults. A lot of jobs have changed. A lot of us spend most of our days, or we did up until a couple of years ago, in the office. So we've gone from spending a significant portion of our time outdoors to much more of our time indoors. And estimates that's around 90%. And about 2/3 of our time is spent in our homes. So that slide on the bottom left is showing you something about how homes have become more airtight. So don't worry too much about the units, but you can see the trend. And we're going from, I think it's the 1940s on the left-hand side there, up to more or less present day. And over that time, ventilation rate has got lower and lower in general in buildings. The plot in the middle at the bottom is showing you a consumer index. And you might wonder why I'm talking about consumer indexes, but basically this is really a proxy for how often we buy new things and bring new things into buildings. So whether that's furnishings or other products, we buy more things than we did 50 years ago after the war. And that's important because we know that new things like building materials, furnishings, give off higher emissions when they're new. So if we are bringing more things into buildings that are more airtight and spending more time in them, you can see that we're being exposed to more and more pollutants in our homes than we used to be. And then obviously the COVID pandemic came along and we spent even more time in our homes. And it looks like the shift in the future is going to be towards more home working. And so the air quality in our homes is going to become even more important. Next slide, please. So for those of you who don't know, I thought it was worth just talking a bit about what a cost action is. And the really nice thing about these is that they can be set up by anyone in any of the member countries, and they can be driven by the science. So it's a bottom-up thing. You can have a cost network on absolutely anything you want to. So they're very open, they're very collaborative, and you have this 4-year work program time where you have various objectives, various working groups, like other proposals, and it's very open. It's particularly aiming to encourage early career researchers, for instance, but also to bring in a wide range of countries from around the European Union and some partner countries beyond, including the UK now, of course. Next slide, please. So for our cost action, what we were aiming to do was, at the end of it, to be able to define a blueprint for the optimal indoor air chemical characterization campaign. So for many years now, in the field of outdoor air quality, we've been running very large field campaigns where lots of groups of scientists from around the UK and beyond would bring their equipment to measure various air pollutants, and maybe sit at a site for 2 or 3 weeks and monitor lots of chemicals simultaneously and in a lot of detail. So it gives a lot of insight into things like urban air quality, maybe the air quality in forests or clean air, for instance. And this, up until a couple of years ago in the US, there hadn't really been anything similar. So our cost action was aiming to think about all the things you'd need to define in order to be able to come up with that blueprint. So we had some aims, which you can see here, obviously advancing the field of indoor air pollution science, training new investigators, highlighting research areas that we need to focus on in the future, and also to try and bridge the gap between research and business. So we started in September 2018. We've got another year or so, and there's both research coordination and capacity building objectives, so a bit different to a standard network. Okay, next slide, please. And in terms of the spread of countries, we've actually got over 200 scientists now. So we started off with 48 original scientists proposing the action from 17 different countries. We've now expanded to over 200 from 37 countries, which is really nice. We've got a really, really good range of different representatives, and they come from businesses, they come from academia, they come from research institutes. So it's a really good mix of people. You can see on that slide, we've got a big UK contingent, which is probably not surprising given that that's, where I'm based, obviously. Okay, next slide. And these were our 6 working groups. So in year one, we were aiming to look at the first 2 at the bottom there and to really try and build on the existing knowledge around indoor air chemistry. So what do we already know? And that was from measurements, but also from modelling. And then the companion working group was looking at indoor and outdoor expertise exchange. So we already know a lot about air quality from all the research that's happened outdoors. What could we learn about that for indoors and vice versa? And then years 2 and 3 were based on the middle row there. So what should we measure indoors? How should we measure those things that we decide are important to measure? And what sort of building should we measure in? And then the final year, which we've just started, is to try and use all of this information to come up with a blueprint. So next slide, please. So the first working group was looking at what we already knew. If you can just click it again, please. There we go. And the report that came out of this is freely available for anyone on our website. And we also published an editorial in Indoor Air in 2020. And it's a really good resource, I think, for anyone starting out, wanting to know more about indoor air. It reviews all the field studies that have happened, thinking about different buildings, what the occupants contribute, microbial activity, chemical transformations, and also modelling. So there's a lot of information in there. It's well over 100 pages. But because we realise not everybody wants to read 100 pages, we've also got a 5-page summary, and then we've got the editorial as well. So I was just going to tell you a little bit about some of the interesting stuff that's coming out of that. So if I can have the next slide, please. And I think one thing that's often overlooked, like I said earlier, when we're thinking about indoor air is the impact of the occupant and also the behaviour. But just to show the importance of the occupant, this is some really nice results from 2010 that came out. And what we're looking at here is the impact of transformations of the components in your skin oil with ozone in air. Okay, so we've all got components in our skin that have carbon-carbon double bonds, which ozone really likes to react with. And that forms chemicals that are emitted from your skin all the time. And you can see that really nicely from these two plots. So if you look at the first scenario there, what's happening is that you have two people in an office, two people that enter an office at 10 o'clock in the morning, and there's about 30 ppb of ozone in there at the start. And you can see that after the people enter the office, the ozone starts to be removed, and you start to form these rather strangely named 6-MHO and 4-OPA. So you don't need to worry about the structure of those, but they're both carbonyls that are emitted from the skin when the skin oil reacts with ozone. And then just to prove that that's chemistry that's causing that, this second scenario there starts off with the two occupants in the office, but without any ozone. And the ozone's actually added at about 12:30 in that second figure. And you can see it's only once the ozone is added that you start to make those skin oil products. So a really nice example of chemistry in action indoors. Okay, and the next slide, please. So this is another study from America. And if you can just press it again, I think there's some more little boxes to appear. Thank you. And again, this is showing the importance of occupants. So this was a lecture theatre in America. And what they were looking at was sampling the inlet and outlet air from this lecture theatre to try and understand the contribution of the occupant. So there's a couple of things to note on this figure that are really interesting, I think. The first one is if you look at the species that are labelled down the left-hand side, what these bar charts are showing is the proportion of that particular chemical species that came from the occupants themselves versus the proportion that came from the supply air. So they also measured these same species outdoors. And then they also measured it in the classroom without any occupants. So that gives you a feel for what's coming off the furnishings in the lecture theatre. And you can see for the vast majority of those chemical species indoors, which are mostly hydrocarbons, it's the occupant that is important there. It's people, the 30 students or so in the lecture theatre that are contributing to this chemical mixture in the lecture theatre. And there's lots of information in this paper at the top there that tells you about these species. And you can see it's very chemically complex. We have lots of different pollutants in this lecture theatre. Okay, next slide, please. So basically, we still have an awful lot to learn, I think, about indoor air chemistry, particularly the role of people. But that's good because that means we've got lots more interesting research to be done. But I think what's becoming really clear is that we learn a lot when indoor and outdoor air scientists get together. So a lot of the information that's coming out now, particularly from the US, has been because outdoor air scientists have brought their very sophisticated instrumentation indoors and made lots of interesting measurements. And I think this has all been put into a sharper focus as well by a paper that came out in Science in 2018 by Brian McDonald and his group. And what this was saying was that actually it's all very well to consider indoor air quality and think about all these personal care products we use and consumer products. But what the McDonald paper showed was that those the indoor emissions of VOCs from these personal care products could also impact outdoor air quality. And it was thought that certainly in the US, where these measurements were made, that could be almost half of what was being observed outdoors. So this kind of changes everything, the way that we've thought about indoor air quality. We've thought a lot in the past about how outdoor air can impact the indoor environment. But what this is showing is that indoors can also impact outdoors. And that's only going to become more important as we electrify the vehicle fleet into the future. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just an example of how outdoor air equipment has been miniaturized and brought indoors. So this is showing a phage instrument, which as a modeler, I would struggle to remember what it means, but it's basically a fluorescence technique that allows you to measure hydroxyl radical concentrations. And hydroxyl radicals are very strong oxidants. So we worry about those indoors or outdoors. They can react with VOCs and form things like formaldehyde, for instance. And what we did in this experiment here was we brought one of these instruments indoors into the lab. And we're able to do that because it had been miniaturized for use on an aircraft. So it's nice to see that these applications for outdoors can be used indoors as well. And what this schematic here is showing is that basically when we did some surface cleaning, so you can see that it's, sorry, I haven't got a pointer, but you can see at 1012 or so, there's a little bump of hydroxyl radicals. That was caused by surface cleaning with a limonene-based cleaner. And there's some interesting chemistry that goes on that produces these radicals. But you can see that the really large peak there around the middle of the day, that was caused when we used an air cleaning device, a so-called air purifier. So this was one of the air cleaning devices that operates using ozone and limonene inside. It actually generated high quantities of hydroxyl radicals. But of course, once you do that inside, you can then start to oxidize VOCs and make things like formaldehyde and particles. So I think Sani alluded to this as well. There's a huge health warning on these air cleaners, and not all of them are a good thing to have indoors. Okay, next slide, please. So just like for the first working group, we produced a final report from working group 2. And there's lots of areas of overlap between indoors and outdoors where scientists are working together. So things like looking at volatility of organic material, formation of particles, some of these oxidants, the radicals, things like the compositional complexity. So outdoor air scientists have got really good now at understanding the chemical complexity of the air, and their knowledge is going to be really useful as we try and do the same indoors. Okay, next slide, please. So I just want to say a little bit more about these 3 working groups. So we are just wrapping these up now. So next slide, please. And I think what might be really useful as a resource for the community is what we're doing, particularly in working group 3, where we're trying to rank which species we should measure indoors. So this has involved an enormous amount of work. So we've basically looked at all the literature, or a huge quantity of literature anyway, on indoor air pollutant measurements. And we have basically looked at all the different sources of those indoor air pollutants. So we have different categories. So we've looked at consumer products, building materials. We've got a special category for green materials. We've looked at some of these photocatalytic kind of materials that you can get that are meant to remove air pollutants. So I think we have 9 or 10 different categories. And then for each of those, we've looked at all the different pollutants that can be that have been reported indoors, and we've also got average measurements of each of those. And then what we have is about 1,000 species. And then, just like with Sani's report, we've tried to think about ways of ranking them. And there are various ways that you can rank these species when you're thinking about which are most important, which do we care about, and you can do that by health, obviously. So we've ranked about 300 of those by health, and it was quite interesting that we didn't get exactly the same list as Sani, so that's quite interesting. But we've also started to think about how we could rank them by reactivity, how we could rank them by maybe their propensity to form particles. So we've nearly finished doing this, and we're hoping that this will be released in the next month or so. And I think it will be a really useful community resource. So you'll be able to click on a species, you'll be able to find all the different sources of that species, you'll be able to find its average concentration. So it should be a really useful database, we think. So how do we measure indoors? So there are lots of different ways that you can measure species indoors. So again, we've been guided by outdoor air scientists here. So we're coming up with we have a special issue in applied spectroscopy reviews, and you can see the different techniques that we're going to consider. So low-cost sensors is a huge area of interest for indoor air, just because of obviously the spatial and cost aspects of it. But we'll also be reporting on more standard techniques for sampling, looking at particulate matter, inorganic compounds. You can see the list there. So hopefully, again, that will be a really interesting review of the instrumentation that's available, and the pros and cons of each for measuring all these different pollutants. And then next slide, please. So where to measure indoors? So this is really tricky. Because you can imagine that every building is different. And and even the same sort of building type, there's going to be big differences between those buildings. So we've been focusing on 5 main types of buildings. Residential, like I said at the start, we spend most of our time in our homes. It's the most important microenvironment for all of us. And then we're going to be looking at office buildings, schools, healthcare facilities, and sports facilities. So those are the places that there are most literature for and where we spend most of our time. And for each of those, we'll be coming up with a list of what needs to be considered. So, what sort of things do you need to measure as well as the chemical species? You need ventilation rate. You need to know where the building is, what the outdoor pollutants are like in any particular building. So it's all that sort of thing as well. Okay, next slide, please. And what we're just starting to think about now is how we bring all of this together and to define the blueprint. So sorry, the title's wrong on this slide. This is the final work package defining the blueprint. And I think what's starting to occur to us is that we are not going to just define one blueprint, because it's going to depend on your scientific question, what you want to know about, what's your priority, is it health, is it chemistry? And what we're going to try and come up with is almost like a flow chart for a campaign. So if this is your research question, if you care about health, what are the priority species? How would you measure them? If you're interested in the chemistry, these are the most reactive species. This is what you should measure. This is how you should measure it. So we're hoping to come up with some kind of interactive flow chart, and this is work in progress for the final year. Okay, next slide. I think it's my final one. Yeah, so this is just to say, do have a look at our website. There's lots of information on there. All the resources are freely available. There will be a lot more by the end of the year when working groups 3 to 5 have finished reporting. And yeah, if you've got any questions, do get in touch. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and thank you for not too much chemistry in that for me. Very useful. I've got a few questions, probably layman's questions, but ones that I think the audience would be interested in. In terms of your research between what I call indoor air quality and outdoor air quality and the various vectors that transform between the two sides, whether you conducted any research during the COVID lockdown and got any learnings from what was happening outside and whether it had impacts on the inside, because offices would close down or schools would close down, and vice versa. I'm aware of some research that was done on the outdoor air quality, but I'm interested in the two.
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. So outdoors, there was a lot of talk about how air quality improved outdoors. But that's quite a general expression. And what actually happened was that some air pollutant concentrations decreased, for sure, so particularly NOx, but some air pollutant concentrations increased. And that one example of that is ozone. And that is because of the complex chemical interaction between those two. So basically, as NOx goes up, ozone goes down and vice versa. So the reason that's important for indoors is that we know that ozone initiates a lot of indoor air chemistry. So the estimates spring during the first national lockdown in the UK were that outdoor ozone increased by about 30%, and that had a knock-on effect on indoors. So modelling studies that were carried out, and you can see this if you refer to the AQUEG report that came out on this very topic last year. Modelling studies showed that the indoor ozone increased by 30 to 50%. And also that had a knock-on effect on things like formaldehyde concentrations, which increased by a similar amount, as did things like particulate concentration cleaning indoors. So there's definitely a knock-on effect, and it's quite an interesting proxy for the future, actually. Again, as we electrify the vehicle fleet, you'd expect a similar impact. So you'd expect ozone to go up outdoors and hence indoors as well, and initiate more of this oxidation chemistry.
There's a need for more research in this area, because I think during lockdown everyone experienced what they perceived to be improved air quality, but the ambient air pollution was still there. And have we got any learnings from this, and what we take going forward, future policy?
Yeah, I think really is that everything's connected. So indoors and outdoors are intimately connected, and when you're thinking about air pollution exposure, you have to think about the whole picture. So we focused far too much in the past on outdoor air pollution exposure. And when you think about estimates of impacts to our health, they're often based on outdoor air quality monitors. To have
Yeah.
more studies where we're looking at personal sampling, so you get the whole picture of someone's air pollution exposure, whether they're outdoors, indoors, commuting. You need to understand it on a much more personal level. So someone could have absolutely, really good air quality outdoors. They might live out in the country where there's no pollution sources nearby, but if they spend all day in their home with the window shut, releasing lots of pollutants indoors, they're still going to have exposure to pollutants, which might not be counted in the.
And I think that brings me to my kind of final question before we open it up for a kind of wider debate, just about behaviour and about education, and just, how do we take all this extremely useful information and knowledge and bring it down to the average man on the street, to make them aware of the issues and the impacts that they might be having on health, on mental health issues, and just communicating that out to the wider world.
Yeah, it's a challenge, but I think generally the people I talk to when I give public lectures and stuff, I think, they're generally very interested. They hadn't thought about it before, but they probably, once people know, I think they do think about it. So I think it's a matter of just trying to get the word out, talking to as many people as possible.